The fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B hummed with an electric tension that made 12-year-old Maya Rodriguez's hands tremble slightly as she clutched her worn leather folder. She had practiced this moment in front of her bathroom mirror countless times over the past 3 months, rehearsing every word, anticipating every objection. But nothing could have prepared her for the weight of reality pressing down on her shoulders as she stood in the gallery, watching her father's future slip away with each passing minute. Carlos Rodriguez sat at the defendant's table, his calloused hands folded neatly in front of him, wearing the only suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to Maya's mother's funeral 5 years ago. At 43, Carlos looked older than his years, the kind of aging that comes from working double shifts at the manufacturing plant and raising a daughter alone. His public defender, a harried woman named Miss Chen, who juggled 17 cases simultaneously, shuffled through papers with the exhausted efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped believing in fairy tale endings. Across the aisle sat the opposing counsel, a team of 3 attorneys from Meridian Development Corporation, their tailored suits probably costing more than Carlos made in 6 months. Lead attorney Richard Blackwood had the kind of polished confidence that comes from never having lost a case that mattered to him personally. To him, this was just another day of removing obstacles to corporate progress. To Maya, it was everything. The case was simple on paper. Meridian Development claimed that Carlos's small auto repair shop violated new zoning regulations and operated without proper permits. They were seeking not just to shut down his business, but to seize the property itself through eminent domain, claiming the land was needed for a luxury condominium development that would revitalize the community. The community, Maya thought bitterly, that had existed there for 40 years didn't apparently need revitalizing until someone saw profit potential. Judge Patricia Thornton, a stern woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, reviewed the documents before her. She had a reputation for fairness but also for following the letter of the law without sentiment. Maya had spent weeks studying every case Judge Thornton had ever presided over, looking for patterns, understanding her legal philosophy. "Miss Chen," Judge Thornton said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the courtroom, "does your client have any evidence to counter the corporation's claims regarding the permit violations?" Miss Chen stood, her fatigue evident in her posture. "Your Honor, Mr. Rodriguez has been attempting to resolve the permit issues, but the city has been unresponsive to his applications for months. We believe there may be undue influence. Objections without evidence are just opinions." "Counselor," Richard Blackwood interrupted smoothly, not even bothering to stand. "The fact remains that Mr. Rodriguez has been operating illegally for 8 months. The law is clear." Maya's grip tightened on her folder. Inside were 73 pages of documentation she had compiled over 13 weeks of investigation. Every afternoon after school, every weekend, every spare moment had been devoted to one purpose: saving her father's business, their home, and their future. The auto shop wasn't just a business. It was where her father had proposed to her mother 20 years ago, surrounded by engine parts and the smell of motor oil. It was where Maya had taken her first steps, where she'd learned to change a tire before she learned algebra, where the community gathered not just for car repairs, but for advice, for comfort, for connection. Mr. Chen from the Chinese restaurant next door would bring them lunch. Mrs. Patterson would stop by to talk about her late husband, while Carlos fixed her ancient station wagon for half price. It was the heart of their neighborhood, and Meridian wanted to rip it out. "Your Honor," Miss Chen tried again, but the weariness in her voice betrayed her lack of conviction. "We request additional time to gather supporting documentation. Your Honor, if I may?" Maya's voice cut through the courtroom like a bell, clear and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every head turned toward her. Judge Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of surprise Maya had seen from the stoic jurist. Richard Blackwood actually turned to look at her, his expression mixing curiosity with condescension. "Young lady," Judge Thornton said, her tone neutral but firm, "this is a legal proceeding. Unless you are a material witness, you need to remain silent." I am a material witness, Your Honor, Maya replied, stepping forward from the gallery. And I have evidence that directly contradicts the corporation's claims. Carlos turned in his seat, his eyes wide with alarm. Maya, no, Majida. Mr. Rodriguez, Judge Thornton said sharply, then returned her attention to Maya. What is your name, and what is your relationship to the defendant? Maya Rodriguez. Your Honor, Carlos Rodriguez is my father. She held up her leather folder. I've been investigating this case for 3 months, and I've discovered evidence of systematic corruption that goes far beyond zoning violations. Richard Blackwood stood now, his polished demeanor cracking slightly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A child cannot possibly have relevant legal evidence, and I object to this obvious attempt to delay proceedings with theatrical distractions. I'm 12 years old, not 6, Maya said, her voice steady, but with an edge that made several people in the gallery lean forward. And I've documented 17 separate instances of illegal collusion between Meridian Development and city officials, including falsified permit denials, manipulated zoning changes, and coordinated harassment of property owners who refused to sell. The silence that followed was profound. Judge Thornton studied Maya for a long moment, and Maya could almost see the calculations happening behind those sharp eyes. Then, unexpectedly, the judge's expression shifted into something that might have been curiosity. Approach the bench, all of you, Judge Thornton commanded. Maya walked forward on legs that felt like water, but somehow carried her anyway. Miss? Chen looked at her with an expression mixing shock and cautious hope. Richard Blackwood's jaw was tight, with barely contained irritation. At the bench, Judge Thornton spoke quietly but firmly. Miss Rodriguez, I admire your devotion to your father, but this court operates under strict rules of evidence and procedure. What you claim to have discovered, if it exists, should be presented by qualified counsel. With respect, Your Honor, Maya replied, opening her folder. Our counsel is managing 17 cases. She hasn't had time to investigate thoroughly. I have. She pulled out the first document. This is a recorded phone call between Meridian's regional director and City Councilman Patrick Morrison, discussing how to expedite the removal of problematic property owners in what they call the Riverside Corridor, which is exactly where my father's shop is located. Richard Blackwood's face paled, slightly. Your Honor, the provenance of this supposed recording. It was recorded legally, sir, Maya interrupted. The conversation took place at a public restaurant, and under state law, I only needed consent from one party. The restaurant owner gave me permission to place a recorder at the table next to where these meetings always happen every Thursday at 7 p.m. Judge Thornton's eyebrows rose higher. How did you know they met there? I followed them, Maya said simply. For 6 weeks. I documented 17 meetings between Meridian representatives and various city officials, all at the same restaurant, all coordinating their actions against property owners. Miss Chen stared at Maya as if seeing her for the first time. Maya, why didn't you tell me about this? I tried, Miss Chen, Maya said gently. I called your office 4 times. You were always in court or with other clients. Your paralegal said you'd call me back, but you never did. I'm not blaming you. I know you're overwhelmed. That's why I kept investigating on my own. Judge Thornton held up her hand for silence. Mr. Blackwood, your client has considerable resources. This child is making serious allegations of corruption. Are you prepared to address them? Richard Blackwood's polished facade cracked further. Your Honor, I knew nothing about any alleged collusion. My firm was hired to handle the legal aspects of property acquisition through legitimate channels. Then you won't mind if I present my evidence, Maya interjected. She pulled out another document. This is an internal email from Meridian CEO, Andrew Hartwell, to your law firm, Mr. Blackwood. In it, he explicitly states that difficult property owners should be encouraged to leave through any means necessary, and that your firm should coordinate with our municipal contacts to create regulatory obstacles. The color drained from Richard Blackwood's face. That email is privileged attorney-client communication. How did you? It was accidentally included in a public records request response, Maya said. The city clerk's office made an error and included it in a packet of documents I requested about zoning changes. Once it entered the public domain through official channels, it lost privilege protection. Judge Thornton's expression had transformed from skepticism to something approaching amazement. You know about attorney-client privilege and public records law? I've been learning, Your Honor, Maya replied. The reference librarian at the county law library, Mrs. Abernathy, has been helping me understand legal procedures. She's been incredible. What Maya didn't mention was the nights she'd stayed up until 2 a.m. reading case law by flashlight so she wouldn't wake her father, or how she'd sacrificed her lunch money for 3 weeks to pay for document copies and recording equipment, or how she'd turned her bedroom into an investigation headquarters with timelines and evidence boards that would have impressed professional investigators. Judge Thornton leaned back, studying the documents Maya had presented. Then she looked at Richard Blackwood with an expression that made the attorney visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to recess this hearing for 48 hours. During that time, I want to review all of Miss Rodriguez's evidence. I'm also ordering an immediate investigation into the allegations of corruption. Your Honor, Blackwood protested. This is based on the unsubstantiated claims of a child. A child who apparently has done more thorough investigation than your entire legal team, Judge Thornton interrupted coldly, and who has raised questions that go to the heart of whether these proceedings are legitimate or part of a corrupt scheme to defraud property owners. She turned to Maya. Miss Rodriguez, I want you to work with Miss Chen over the next 2 days to properly document and present your evidence according to legal standards. Miss Chen, I'm reassigning your other cases temporarily. This one deserves your full attention. Maya felt her knees weaken with relief, but she kept her voice steady. Thank you, Your Honor. As the judge gavelled the recess, Richard Blackwood stormed out of the courtroom, already on his phone. Maya knew she had just made powerful enemies, but she had also just bought her father time to fight back, time to expose the truth. Carlos approached her, tears in his eyes. Mija, what you did? How did you? Later, Dad, Maya said, squeezing his hand. Right now, Miss Chen and I have work to do. Miss Chen looked at Maya with newfound respect. You said you have 17 instances of corruption documented? 17 that I could prove conclusively, Maya corrected. I suspect there are at least 30 more. But I haven't finished investigating those yet. Yet, Miss Chen repeated with the first genuine smile Maya had seen from her. Kid, when this is over, remind me to write you a letter of recommendation for law school. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave the courtroom, Maya caught a glimpse of several people in the gallery, other small business owners who were also fighting Meridian's expansion plans. They looked at her with expressions of hope they hadn't worn in months. Maya understood then that this case had become about more than just her father's auto shop. It was about whether ordinary people could stand up to corporate power, whether justice was still possible when money seemed to control everything, and whether one determined 12-year-old could make a difference in a world that often ignored the voices of children. She thought about her mother, who had always told her that silence in the face of injustice was a choice, and not one Maya should ever make. Her mother wasn't here to see this moment, but Maya felt her presence in every document she'd gathered, every interview she'd conducted, every late night spent fighting for what was right. The battle was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. But as Maya walked out of that courtroom beside her father, her folder full of evidence under her arm, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not stop fighting until justice was served, no matter how powerful the opposition, no matter how long it took, because some silences, Maya had learned, are impossible to maintain when everything you love is at stake. The conference room in Miss Chen's law office smelled of stale coffee and desperation. But Maya barely noticed as she spread out her evidence across the scratched wooden table. It was 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, 40 hours into the 48 Judge Thornton had given them, and they had worked virtually non-stop since leaving the courtroom. Miss Chen, who had insisted Maya call her Jennifer after the first 12 hours of collaboration, sat across from her, surrounded by legal pads covered in notes. Her exhaustion had transformed into something electric. For the first time in years, she was working on a case that felt like it mattered, really mattered. And she had a partner whose dedication matched her own. "Walk me through the Morrison connection again," Jennifer said, rubbing her temples. "The timing is crucial." Maya pulled up her timeline, a meticulously color-coded chart that stretched across 3 poster boards. Councilman Patrick Morrison joined the zoning committee 14 months ago. Within 60 days, he introduced 11 amendments to the Riverside District Zoning Code, all of which made it harder for small businesses like my dad's to operate. He claimed it was about modernization and safety standards. She pointed to a series of red marks on the timeline. "But look at these dates. 6 days before each amendment was proposed, Morrison met with Meridian representatives at La Bella Vista restaurant. I have photographs, time-stamped receipts from nearby businesses, and 3 of the recordings." Jennifer leaned forward. "The recordings are our strongest evidence, but we need to establish the pattern." "What about the other council members?" Maya flipped to a new section. "That's where it gets interesting." Morrison wasn't working alone. Council members Sarah Jennings and Thomas Wu also had regular contact with Meridian, but they were more careful about it. They communicated through intermediaries, specifically through a consultant named Gregory Nash. "Who is Gregory Nash?" Jennifer asked, already typing the name into her laptop. "On paper, he's an independent urban planning consultant," Maya replied, pulling out a thick dossier. "But I found his LLC registration documents." Gregory Nash Consulting was formed 3 weeks after Meridian announced their Riverside development plans. And guess who the silent partner is? Jennifer looked up from her computer. "Don't tell me." "Andrew Hartwell's brother-in-law," Maya finished. "Bradley Hartwell Nash. He changed his name legally 2 years ago, probably to hide the family connection. But property records don't lie. He and Andrew Hartwell co-own 4 investment properties together." Jennifer whistled low. "So Meridian created a fake consulting firm to funnel bribes to council members through consulting fees. That's not just corruption, that's organized fraud." Maya nodded grimly. Nash's firm paid a total of $340,000 to various council members over 13 months for advisory services. The payments always came 2 weeks before crucial votes. "I have bank records." "How did you get bank records?" Jennifer asked, then held up her hand. "Wait, don't tell me. Public records request?" "Better," Maya said, with a slight smile. Nash's consulting firm took out a small business loan that required financial disclosure. Those disclosures are public record at the State Commerce Department. "Mrs. Abernathy helped me file the right forms." Jennifer shook her head in amazement. "You're either going to be the best lawyer I've ever seen, or the world's most terrifying investigative journalist." "Can't I be both?" Maya asked, and for the first time in days, they both laughed. But the humor faded quickly. They still had work to do, and the clock was ticking. Judge Thornton wanted a complete presentation in 28 hours, and they were building a case that could bring down some of the most powerful people in the city. "What about your father's permits?" Jennifer asked, returning to business. "We need to show not just that there was corruption, but that it directly affected his case." Maya pulled out another folder, this one marked with a red tab. Dad applied for his business license renewal 7 months ago, well before the deadline. The city acknowledged receipt, but then his application mysteriously disappeared from the system. She laid out a series of documents, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all communications related to my father's business. It took them the full 30 days to respond, but they finally sent me everything. And look at this email. Jennifer read the highlighted section, and her expression darkened. This is from the city clerk's office to the permits department. Per Councilman Morrison's office, any applications from properties in the Riverside targeted zone should be processed with maximum scrutiny and delayed where possible. That's explicit obstruction of legal business operations. It gets worse, Maya said quietly. Look at the date on that email. Jennifer checked, and her eyes widened. This was sent 3 days before the city claimed they never received your father's application. They received it, Maya said, her voice hard with controlled anger. They deliberately lost it to create grounds for shutting him down. And they did the same thing to at least 8 other business owners in the Riverside corridor. She pulled out more documents. I contacted every small business owner facing similar charges, 12 of them. 8 had their permits lost or delayed indefinitely. 3 were subjected to surprise safety inspections that found suddenly critical violations that had never been mentioned in previous inspections. And 1 Mr. Hassan's Corner Grocery was actually condemned as structurally unsafe, despite having passed a structural inspection just 6 months earlier. Did you document all of this? Jennifer asked, though she already knew the answer. Affidavits from all 12 business owners. Copies of their original permits and applications. Comparison photos showing that the unsafe conditions cited didn't actually exist. And Maya paused dramatically. A signed statement from the structural engineer who condemned Mr. Hassan's building. Jennifer's eyebrows rose. He actually admitted wrongdoing? Not exactly, Maya said. But he did admit that he was hired by Meridian Development to conduct the inspection, not by the city. The city just rubber-stamped his report. When I pointed out that this was a conflict of interest, he got very nervous. I think he's worried about losing his license. Jennifer made a note. We can use that. The engineer's statement establishes that Meridian was actively involved in creating false grounds for property seizure. She paused. Maya, how did you even know to ask these questions? Most professional investigators wouldn't think to check who hired the engineer. Maya looked down at her timeline, at the hundreds of hours of work it represented. My mom used to say that the truth is usually hiding in plain sight. People get sloppy when they think no one is watching, or that watchers don't matter. They didn't think anyone would connect all these dots because they were counting on the business owners being too busy surviving to investigate and too poor to hire investigators. They didn't count on you, Jennifer said quietly. No, Maya agreed. They didn't. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Abernathy at the County Law Library. Found the precedent you needed. Columbia Trust v. Harrison County, 1998. Legal Framework for Proving Systematic Corruption in Property Seizures. I'm scanning the documents now. Maya showed the text to Jennifer. Mrs. Abernathy has been amazing. She's been staying late at the library every night to help me research. Remind me to send her the biggest thank you basket in history when this is over, Jennifer muttered, typing notes. A 1998 precedent is perfect. It's established law, but specific to exactly what we're trying to prove. They worked through the night, organizing evidence, preparing exhibits, and crafting legal arguments. Maya learned more about courtroom procedure in those hours than she could have learned in a year of law school. Jennifer, in turn, was reminded of why she'd become a lawyer in the first place, not to process cases like widgets on an assembly line, but to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. At 3 a.m., Carlos appeared in the doorway with thermoses of coffee and homemade tamales. He looked at the evidence spread across the table, at his daughter's determined expression, and his eyes filled with tears. Mija, he said softly, you shouldn't have to do this. You should be at home, sleeping, being a kid. Maya stood and hugged him fiercely. Dad, I'm being a kid. Kids protect their families. Kids fight for what's right. Mom taught me that. Carlos nodded, unable to speak. He set down the food and coffee. He didn't know what else to do, except trust that his daughter's extraordinary mind and determination would somehow be enough. By dawn, they had assembled a presentation that would have impressed any prosecutor. Maya had organized the evidence into clear categories: collusion, fraud, obstruction of justice, and systematic harassment. Each category had multiple supporting documents, witness statements, and recordings. "This is good," Jennifer said, reviewing their work. "You understand what's going to happen when we present this in court tomorrow?" "They're going to fight back," Maya said. "Hard." "Very hard," Jennifer confirmed. "Richard Blackwood is going to attack your credibility. He's going to argue that a 12-year-old couldn't possibly have gathered legitimate evidence. He's going to try to make you look like a child playing detective." Maya met her eyes steadily. "Let him try. Every piece of evidence I gathered is documented and verified. Every conclusion I drew is supported by facts. I'm not playing detective, Jennifer. I'm doing the work that should have been done months ago." Jennifer smiled. "Then let's go show them what real justice looks like." At 9 a.m., they reconvened in courtroom 4B. But this time, the room was packed. Word had spread about Maya's allegations, and local news media had picked up the story. Reporters lined the walls, cameras ready. The other Riverside business owners sat in solidarity in the gallery. Even Mrs. Abernathy was there, giving Maya an encouraging nod. Richard Blackwood looked like he hadn't slept either, but his exhaustion came from stress rather than productive work. He was accompanied now by 2 additional attorneys and a grim-faced man Maya recognized from her photos as Andrew Hartwell himself, CEO of Meridian Development. Judge Thornton entered and immediately noticed the increased attendance. "This hearing is open to the public, but I will tolerate no disruptions. Counselors, are you ready to proceed?" Jennifer stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We're prepared to present compelling evidence of systematic corruption in the Riverside property seizure cases." "Your Honor," Richard Blackwood interrupted. "Before we begin, I must object to the involvement of Miss Rodriguez, the minor child, in these proceedings. She is not a qualified investigator, and any evidence she gathered is suspect." Judge Thornton turned to Maya, who stood beside Jennifer. "Miss Rodriguez, Mr. Blackwood raises a valid point about qualifications. How do you respond?" Maya took a breath and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, I'm not claiming to be a professional investigator, but I am a citizen with the right to gather publicly available information. Every document I obtained was legally acquired through public records requests, voluntary interviews, or legal recordings in public spaces. I violated no laws and followed proper procedures for evidence collection, which Mrs. Abernathy at the County Law Library helped me verify at each step." She paused. "The question isn't whether I'm qualified to gather evidence. The question is whether the evidence itself is valid. And I believe when you review what we've compiled, you'll find that it meets every legal standard for admissibility." Judge Thornton's expression remained neutral, but Maya thought she detected a hint of approval in those sharp eyes. "Proceed with your presentation, Miss Chen. I'll evaluate the evidence on its merits." What followed was 3 hours of methodical revelation. Jennifer presented each piece of evidence with legal precision, while Maya provided context and explanations. The recorded phone calls were damning. The emails were devastating. The financial records of Gregory Nash's consulting firm traced a clear pattern of bribery. But the moment that changed everything came when Maya presented a surprise witness she had convinced to testify just that morning. "Your Honor," Maya said, "we call Marcus Webb to the stand." A middle-aged man stood from the gallery, his face pale but resolute. Richard Blackwood stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we were not informed of any additional witnesses. Mr. Webb came forward this morning after learning of this hearing," Jennifer explained. "We believe his testimony is crucial." Marcus Webb took the stand and was sworn in. Maya approached him gently. "Mr. Webb, Can you please tell the court your occupation? I'm a senior project manager at Meridian Development, he said quietly. Several gasps rippled through the courtroom. Or I was, until I resigned this morning. And why are you here today? Maya asked. Webb looked directly at Andrew Hartwell, who had gone very still. Because I can't stay silent anymore about what I've seen. For the past year, I've been part of meetings where executives discussed strategies to force out Riverside property owners through manufactured violations and coordinated pressure with city officials. I have copies of internal memos, meeting minutes, and recordings of conference calls where these plans were discussed in detail. The courtroom erupted. Judge Thornton gavelled for silence. Richard Blackwood looked like he might be ill. And Andrew Hartwell stood abruptly, heading for the exit, only to find 2 FBI agents blocking the door. Agents who had been quietly contacted by the judge that morning after reviewing Maya's preliminary evidence. Maya watched as her carefully constructed case shifted from civil hearing to criminal investigation in real time. Everything she had fought for, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, it had led to this moment of truth that could no longer be denied or dismissed. And as she met her father's tearful, proud gaze from across the courtroom, Maya knew that sometimes justice required someone to speak when everyone else had been silenced by fear or indifference. The battle wasn't over, but the truth had finally emerged into the light, and nothing would ever be the same again. 3 months after the hearing that would later be called the Riverside Revelation, Maya Rodriguez sat in her father's rebuilt auto shop, now officially recognized as a historic community landmark and protected from any future development seizures. The late afternoon sun streamed through the spotless windows, illuminating the new sign Carlos had installed, Rodriguez and Daughter Auto Repair Est. 1985. The and daughter part had been Maya's condition for agreeing to let her father add her name. She insisted it acknowledge her partnership in the business, a business she had literally fought in court to save. But the shop was just the beginning of the changes that had swept through their community like a long-awaited spring rain after years of drought. Jennifer Chen, who now insisted everyone call her Jennifer, sat across from Maya at a work table converted into a makeshift conference space. Spread between them were documents from what had become known as the Riverside Justice Project, a nonprofit legal aid organization they had founded together to help other communities facing similar corporate predation. 17 more cases this week, Jennifer said, reviewing the intake forms. From 7 different states. Maya, your testimony at the Senate hearing last month has inspired people everywhere to come forward. Maya pushed her glasses up her nose, new glasses, properly fitted ones, her father could finally afford, after the city settled his lawsuit for $2.3 million in damages, and lost business. We can't help them all ourselves, she said practically. But we can train local advocates to use the same investigative techniques. That was Maya's latest project, a handbook she was writing called The Citizen's Guide to Uncovering Corruption, designed to teach ordinary people how to use public records, laws, legal research resources, and proper documentation methods to expose wrongdoing in their own communities. The ACLU had already committed to publishing and distributing it nationwide. Mrs. Abernathy entered the shop, carrying a box of newly printed materials. At 67, the librarian had become an unexpected hero of the story. Multiple news outlets had featured her work helping Maya, and she'd become a national advocate for properly funding public libraries as crucial resources for civic engagement. The new training materials are here, Mrs. Abernathy announced, setting down the box. Including one from 60 Minutes. Maya groaned softly. The media attention had been overwhelming. While she understood its importance for spreading their message, she missed the anonymity of being just another middle school student, except she wasn't in middle school anymore. She'd been accepted into a specialized early college program that allowed her to take high school and college courses simultaneously while continuing her advocacy work. Can we schedule those for next month? Maya asked. I need to finish preparing for the Anderson case testimony. The Anderson case was another housing fraud situation in Nevada, and Maya had been asked to testify as an expert witness on identifying patterns of municipal corruption, a surreal role for a 13-year-old, but one she'd grown into with remarkable grace. Carlos emerged from the garage bay, wiping his hands on a rag. Business had tripled since the trial, partly from sympathetic customers, but mostly because the publicity had revealed what the neighborhood had always known. Carlos Rodriguez was an honest mechanic who did exceptional work at fair prices. He now employed 4 other mechanics and had a waiting list of clients. "Mija, are you forgetting something?" Carlos asked, checking his watch. Maya glanced at the clock and jumped up. "The ceremony. I'm sorry. I lost track of time. Today was the official dedication of the Riverside Community Protection Act, a new city ordinance that prevented the kind of manipulative zoning changes and permit obstructions that Meridian had used." Maya had been invited to speak at the ceremony, along with city officials who were decidedly different from those who had been in power 4 months ago. The investigation triggered by Maya's evidence had been devastating for Meridian Development and its collaborators. Andrew Hartwell was currently serving a 7-year federal sentence for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Councilman Patrick Morrison had resigned in disgrace and pleaded guilty to accepting bribes. Sarah Jennings and Thomas Wu faced similar charges, as did 6 other city employees who had participated in the scheme. Richard Blackwood's law firm had been dissolved. While Blackwood himself hadn't been charged criminally, his legal license was under review, and multiple civil suits had been filed against him by property owners his firm had victimized. Gregory Nash, the fake consultant, had turned state's evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence, providing detailed testimony that implicated dozens of other officials in similar schemes across 3 states. His testimony had sparked federal investigations into corporate corruption that were still unfolding. But the human impact of Maya's courage went far beyond criminal prosecutions. All 12 of the Riverside business owners not only kept their properties, but received substantial settlements. Mr. Hassan's grocery store, which had been condemned as structurally unsafe, was found to be perfectly sound and was formally apologized to by the city. He used part of his settlement to expand into the vacant lot next door, creating a community center where local kids could do homework after school. The city had established a Riverside Recovery Fund with $15 million to help repair the damage done to the community. New businesses were opening. Property values were rising naturally, without displacement. The neighborhood was thriving on its own terms, not according to some developer's vision of what it should be. Maya, Jennifer, Mrs. Abernathy, and Carlos arrived at City Hall 30 minutes later. The plaza was crowded with hundreds of people, not just Riverside residents but citizens from across the city who had been inspired by the story of a 12-year-old girl who refused to accept injustice. Mayor Helena Rodriguez, no relation to Maya, though they joked about the coincidence, had been elected in a special election 3 months ago on a platform of transparency and accountability. She approached Maya with a warm smile. "Miss Rodriguez," the mayor said, shaking Maya's hand with genuine respect, "thank you for coming. This ceremony wouldn't mean anything without you." "Thank you for actually listening to citizens," Maya replied. "That means more than any ceremony." The mayor had proven to be genuine in her reforms. She'd established an independent oversight committee for zoning decisions, created a public database tracking all city official contacts with developers, and implemented a whistleblower protection program that encouraged city employees to report corruption without fear of retaliation. As Maya took her place on the stage, she looked out at the crowd and saw faces she recognized. There was Marcus Webb, the Meridian manager, who had become a whistleblower and now ran a consulting firm, helping companies implement ethical business practices. There were the other Riverside business owners, their businesses saved and flourishing. There were students from her school, many of whom had been inspired to get involved in civic activism themselves. And there, in the front row, was Dr. Patricia Thornton, retired Judge Thornton, who had stepped down from the bench to join the faculty at the law school, where she was now teaching a course on judicial ethics and the importance of listening to unconventional witnesses. She had told reporters that Maya's case had reminded her why she'd become a judge in the first place. The mayor began her speech, But Maya's attention drifted to her own prepared remarks. She'd written and rewritten them a dozen times, trying to capture what she wanted to say without sounding preachy or self-important. And now, I'd like to invite Maya Rodriguez to share her thoughts on this historic day, the mayor concluded. Maya stepped to the microphone, suddenly aware of the cameras and the hundreds of eyes focused on her. For a moment, she was 12 again, standing in that courtroom with trembling hands and a folder full of evidence, hoping someone would listen. Thank you, Mayor Rodriguez. And thank you to everyone who came today, Maya began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 4 months ago, I stood in a courtroom because I was angry and scared. Angry that powerful people thought they could steal from my father and our community without consequences. Scared that I might fail, that no one would listen to a kid. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I learned something important during those 3 months of investigation, and that day in court. I learned that the system isn't designed to silence us. We silence ourselves by believing that's how it works. We accept injustice because we think we're too small, too young, too poor, too busy, too powerless to fight it. Maya's eyes found her father in the crowd. My dad taught me to fix engines. He taught me that every machine has a logical structure, and if something isn't working right, you investigate until you find the problem. Then, you fix it. Corruption works the same way. It seems complicated and overwhelming. But it's actually pretty simple. People with power abuse it, and they count on the rest of us being too intimidated to investigate. Several people in the crowd nodded. Maya continued, her confidence growing. Mrs. Abernathy taught me how to research. She taught me that public libraries aren't just places to borrow books, they're democratic institutions designed to give every citizen, regardless of wealth, access to the information they need to participate fully in society. When I walked into that library 3 months before the hearing, I didn't know the first thing about law or investigation. But Mrs. Abernathy believed that my questions mattered and that I deserved answers. The librarian wiped away tears, and several people applauded. Jennifer Chen taught me about justice, Maya said, smiling at her friend and mentor. Real justice. Not the assembly line processing that happens when public defenders are so overwhelmed that cases become just numbers on a docket. Jennifer showed me that every case matters. Every person deserves vigorous representation, and sometimes the system needs outside pressure to remember its own values. Jennifer nodded, her own eyes misty. But here's what I want everyone to understand, Maya said, her voice growing stronger. I'm not special. I'm not unusually smart or brave. I'm just a kid who got angry enough to do something about it, and who was lucky enough to have people who believed in me. Every single person here has the same power I had. You can file public records requests. You can attend city council meetings. You can document what you see. You can ask questions. You can refuse to be silenced. She pulled out her worn leather folder, the same one she'd carried into court 4 months ago. This folder represents 3 months of work. But you know what it really represents? It represents the idea that ordinary citizens, even young ones, can hold powerful people accountable. That's not a special skill. That's democracy. That's how it's supposed to work. Maya held up the folder for everyone to see. I'm donating this to the city archives because I want future generations to see what's possible. I want kids 50 years from now to look at these documents and think, if she could do it, so can I. I want them to know that you don't need wealth or connections or degrees to fight for what's right. You just need determination, access to information, and the courage to speak up when everyone expects you to stay quiet. The crowd erupted in applause. Maya waited for it to subside before continuing. The Riverside Community Protection Act we're celebrating today is important, but it's just one law in one city. Across this country, there are thousands of communities facing similar corporate predation. There are thousands of families being pushed out, businesses being destroyed, neighborhoods being erased, all in the name of development and profit. She paused, looking directly at the cameras. But you can. Don't accept injustice just because it's being done by people with titles and expensive lawyers. And most importantly, Don't let anyone tell you that you're too young, too inexperienced, or too insignificant to make a difference. Maya's voice softened. My mother died when I was 7. Before she passed, she told me that the most important thing in life was to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. She said that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit, and that every voice matters, no matter how small it seems. She looked at her father, who was crying openly now. Mom didn't live to see this day, but everything I did because she taught me that love means fighting for the people and communities we care about. Dad showed me that strength isn't about physical power, it's about integrity and consistency. And everyone who supported us showed me that we're never really fighting alone, even when it feels like we are. Maya stepped back from the microphone, her prepared speech complete. But then she stepped forward again, one more thought occurring to her. One last thing, she said. People keep calling me a hero. Heroes are people who have special powers or abilities that the rest of us don't have. What I did, any of you could do. I'm just someone who refused to accept that things had to be the way they were. I'm just someone who believed that truth matters and that systems should serve people, not profit. She folded her speech and smiled. So, don't call me a hero. Call me what I really am, a citizen who cared enough to do the work. Then ask yourself what work you're going to do to make your community better. Because that's how real change happens, not through heroes, but through ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice as normal. The applause this time was thunderous. People stood. Cameras flashed. And Maya stood there, 13 years old and already a catalyst for change across the nation, feeling both humbled and empowered by what had begun as a desperate attempt to save her father's auto shop. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Maya was surrounded by well-wishers and other kids asking for advice on their own community issues. She patiently answered questions, shared resources, and encouraged each person to believe in their own capacity to make a difference. Later that evening, back at the auto shop that now bore her name, Maya sat with her father, Jennifer, and Mrs. Abernathy, sharing pizza and stories. They had become an unlikely family, bound together by a shared belief that justice was worth fighting for. You know what the best part of all this is? Carlos said, looking around at his thriving business and the community that had rallied to support it. It's not the money or the publicity. It's that Maya learned she has a voice, and she's teaching others to use theirs. That's the real legacy, Mrs. Abernathy agreed. Not the policies that change, or the criminals who go to jail, but the shift in consciousness, people realizing they don't have to accept corruption and injustice as inevitable. Jennifer raised her soda can in a toast. To Maya, who reminded us all that the system works when citizens refuse to let it fail. Maya clinked her can against the others. To everyone who believed that a kid with a folder full of evidence deserved to be heard. You changed my life, and together, we're changing the world, one community at a time. As the night deepened and they continued talking and planning the next phases of the Riverside Justice Project, Maya thought about how far they'd come in just 4 months. But more importantly, she thought about how far they could still go. There were more communities to protect, more families to defend, more injustices to expose. The work was far from finished. In some ways, it was just beginning. But Maya had learned that you don't need to solve every problem to make a difference. You just need to solve the one in front of you, then move on to the next. Step by step, case by case, voice by voice, that's how lasting change happens. Her mother had taught her to stand up for what's right. Her father had taught her the value of honest work. Mrs. Abernathy had taught her how to find information. Jennifer had taught her how to use it legally and effectively. And now, Maya would spend her life teaching others the same lessons that every person, regardless of age or resources, has the power to demand justice, to expose corruption, and to create the change they want to see in the world. Because in the end, that's what democracy truly is. Not a system imposed from above, but a practice engaged in by ordinary people who refuse to stay silent when silence would be easier. Maya Rodriguez had found her voice in a courtroom, fighting for her father's business. But that voice had become something much larger, a reminder to everyone who heard it that justice isn't a gift granted by those in power. It's a right claimed by those brave enough to demand it. And that was a lesson that would ripple outward for generations to come. The end.